This is a special report on the murder and cover-up of Jeffrey Epstein. FBI boss Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, Dan Bongino, and Todd Blanche are well aware that enough evidence exists for a homicide-capable investigation. Jeffrey Epstein did not commit suicide.
This is Mark Epstein. I'm willing to answer questions because I know there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of, conspiracy theory, things that don't make any sense. So I'd like, clear up a bunch of things. If people have questions, I'll just stick to the facts, as I usually do. Okay, first of all, Jeffrey had 3 broken bones in his neck. She said that it wasn't the hyoid fracture. He had 3 broken bones in his neck, the hyoid and the thyroid cartilage. Also, the top bunk is a lot more than 6 inches off the ground. So, Robin Williams hung himself from a doorknob, which is approximately 36 or 40 inches off the ground. So you don't need a lot of height to do what's called the. The thing is, he wasn't hanging. He didn't hang himself, but you can hang yourself that way. You don't have to jump. You don't have to snap your neck. What you do, you have something tied around your neck as you sit down.
Yes, to what degree do you know what was going on?
Okay, it's a legitimate question I've been asked many times. Hey, the building in question is a building I own with, or most of it with somebody else. We have over 100 condo units in there. Jeffrey was using some. He was paying the maintenance on those apartments, so he was basically my tenant. He was my brother. He was also a tenant. I honestly did not know which apartments he was using. My partner manages that building. He wanted apartments. I said, let him pay the maintenance on them. I know that his pilots used the apartments when they were in New York. He had to put them up. I know that his attorneys used some. I knew he had other guests in the building, but I didn't know what was going on there. I don't know if any of the so-called abuse took place in that building itself. I'm not aware of it. And I've said before, my job here is not to defend my brother's actions, what he was charged with. I'm only concerned with the fact that he was murdered. I'm not his defense attorney. I know he admitted to me that he was with women that were too young. I do know that, but as far as a lot of the other charges, I'm not aware of them. So I really can't comment more than that. But do I feel any responsibility? None whatsoever. It's also known that prior to Jeffrey's death, I had not seen him for 7 years. We were in communication by phone calls or emails regularly, but we never got together. We had different lifestyles, different groups of friends, different homes in different cities. So we didn't get together for 7 years. And prior to that, we didn't get together very often after 2004. This was back around 2006 when he was first getting into trouble. I was in New York. He was in New York. He asked me to come to his place. He wanted to talk to me. So I went to see what was up. And when I went to his place, he told me that he was getting in trouble for being with girls that were too young. He said he was stupid. And he was getting in trouble for being with girls that were too young. So that's how I found out. He told me directly. He wanted me to hear it from him as opposed to hearing it, on the news or something like that.
Gotcha. Thank you for answering my question. I wasn't trying to be antagonistic towards you. I was just...
No. I didn't take it that way. It's a legitimate question.
Mark, there's been a recent release from CBS News, and they released an additional 90 pictures of the day your brother died, of the autopsy of his cell. I wondered if you knew about that and if you had any comment about that release.
Where do you think they got the photos?
Well, based on the way you're phrasing the question, did you have anything to do with providing the photos?
Yes, I did.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. So, what's the back? Are you willing to give some background story on how those photos turned out?
Yeah, I got a disc of photos from the medical examiner's office of the crime scene, of the autopsy, the medical stuff, his bones, his body, the crime scene, and just all the photographs from the medical examiner's office, stuff in the cell, pictures of him in the hospital, dead in the hospital. One of the questions was, I have a photograph. I'm not sure if it's shown there. I'm not sure if they showed everything, where he's laying on a hospital gurney, on his back. He was, he was dead for a few hours, couple of hours at least before they found him, and he was dressed in a hospital gown. So my question was like, who decided to dress this dead guy in a hospital gown? Because he wasn't wearing a hospital gown in prison. He was in his orange, outfit. So someone at some point in time decided to dress this dead guy in a hospital gown. Were they trying to make it look like he was salvageable, or even when they were wheeling him out of the prison and they showed that he was intubated and they're squeezing the air balloon to put air into his chest, I mean, he was dead for at least 2 hours. It was like, was this a charade to try to make it look like he was still alive or savable? Because one thing I learned is that sort of in prison culture is nobody dies in prison. If they find somebody dead in prison, they ship them off to the hospital and they're declared dead in the hospital. They don't get declared dead in the prison because they don't want the paperwork. So this is all like a charade. So again, who put him in a hospital gown? I also was told by somebody on the scene that in the prison infirmary and all the way to the hospital, there was somebody with a handheld video camera taping everything. Where are those tapes? Where's the footage from that handheld video camera? Nobody's seen them. Nobody's heard about it.
It was a prison employee that was doing the filming with the hand.
Somebody in the prison. It was somebody in the prison. Who it was? Whether it was a prison employee or a BI or somebody else, I have no idea who it was. So I don't speculate. All I know is I was told by a reliable source who was on the scene that somebody had a handheld video camera.
That's insane.
Also, they released the footage of the. I tried to say it before when we got cut out. Bill Barr made that stupid statement that he saw that nobody went in or out of the tier, and that convinced him it was a suicide. When I heard that, I knew there was some kind of cover-up going on. Because, first of all, I always make it really clear, when I first heard that Jeffrey was dead from an apparent suicide, I had no reason to doubt it. So I assumed, okay, he took himself out. He didn't want to spend time in jail. I didn't give it much thought because there was no reason initially to doubt it. But then the next day, when they did the autopsy, and the autopsy was performed by Dr. Kristen Roman, who was the city pathologist, sort of on call that day, and then I had Dr. Michael Baden there. They came out of the autopsy saying they couldn't call it a suicide. It looked too much like a homicide. And on the initial death certificate, which we got that day because you needed a death certificate to claim a body, the cause of death said pending further study. It's exactly what it said, pending further study. And then a few days later, the Chief Medical Examiner, Barbara Samson, she calls it a suicide. No explanation of what other study was done. And let's be really clear, Barbara Samson never saw Jeff's body. She was not in the autopsy. She was not in the office that day. It was a Sunday when they did the autopsy. She wasn't there. And then Bill Barr says, he saw that nobody went in or out of the tier, and that convinced him it was a suicide, completely forgetting about the fact that there were 12 other prisoners or so on that tier that could have killed somebody without having to go and come. And, by his statement saying that he saw that nobody went in or out of the tier, it leads you to believe that he was seeing the door to the tier from outside. But the recent release of the videotape shows that the tape does not show the door to the tier. So even if somebody did get there, sneak inside, kill somebody, and leave, they wouldn't be caught on camera. So Bill Barr's entire conclusion is based on bullshit. And then in his recent testimony, he said that he was questioned about Dr. Baden's determination, and he said Dr. Baden came after the fact. And that's not true. Dr. Baden was one of the two pathologists that was at the actual autopsy, the only two pathologists that were at the autopsy. And that doesn't appear in the DOJ report. And nobody talks about the fact that the two pathologists that performed the autopsy said they wouldn't call it a suicide because it looked too much like a homicide.
So what kind of authority did it take? I mean, who was able to override those two people that said they're not going to call it a suicide because it looks too much like a homicide? So the person that was chosen override them? Do you know who it was? And
it was Barbara Samson, who was the chief medical examiner. He called it a suicide. Now, understand that Dr. Baden, who said this, he used to be the chief medical examiner for New York City. Dr. Baden is in his 90s now. He's been doing this stuff for a very long time, and nobody has done more prison death autopsies than Dr. Baden. Because back in the night, I don't know how young everybody here is, but back in the 1970s, there was a big prison riot in New York State. It was an Attica prison. And the reason there was a riot is because guards were killing prisoners, shipping them off to the hospital, and it was labeled a suicide. So the prisoners realized what was going on, so they rioted. It was a big riot. Guards were killed, prisoners were killed. At the time, Governor Rockefeller called in the National Guard to call the riot, and he heard the prisoners' complaints, so he set up a special independent body to investigate prison deaths in New York State. He couldn't give the job to the local sheriffs because the local sheriffs were in charge of the prisons. So he put together an independent, arm's length body. And in the 1970s, Dr. Baden was put on that commission to investigate prison deaths. I believe Dr. Baden is still on that commission. So for the last 50 years, most, if not all, of the prison deaths in New York State and New York City prisons, Dr. Baden has done the autopsy. So, like I said, nobody has more experience than Dr. Baden when it comes to prison deaths. And he said he never saw a case of a hanging like this where there were 3 broken bones in the person's neck. And Jeffrey had 3 broken bones in his neck, which is more consistent with potentially a karate chop to the front of the neck or manual strangulation of some kind. So when, like I said, until they came out of the autopsy saying they wouldn't call it a suicide because it looked too much like a homicide, I was fully believed that he committed suicide. But then the facts don't look that way. And then when you look at all the other nonsense, cameras weren't working, guards didn't do their job, and then all the lies taking place. And then Kash Patel also recently, months ago, in a testimony, he said, he was questioned about it, and he said it was a suicide. He said, a suicide when you see one. That was what he said. A suicide when you see one. Well, I heard that, and I thought, what a jackass, because how many suicides has he actually seen? First of all, he didn't see Jeffrey's body. He didn't see the crime scene. He wasn't there. And he's not a doctor. He's not a medical examiner. I said maybe he has a certificate, then he passed the CPR course. And what's his qualifications? Claiming that it's a suicide. So there's too many things that don't make sense. Let me try to shut that off. If it was a real suicide, it would be pretty straightforward and easy. There wouldn't be all this subterfuge and lying. And in Bill Barr's testimony, he said recently that he was questioned about Dr. Baden, and he said Baden came in after the fact. And that's not the case. Baden was at the autopsy on my behalf. A lot of things that Bill Barr has been saying about this is just provably false. So if there's a cover-up, he's very key to this cover-up. He was the Attorney General of that time. Kash Patel is the FBI director. So if Jeff was killed, and if there's a cover-up, then also Barr admitted there has never been a homicide investigation. By calling it a suicide early on, it stops any investigation. Because if it's truly a suicide, there's usually only 2 questions. It's the how and the why. And the how is very obvious when you come across a suicide victim. They hung themselves, they shot themselves, they jumped off a building. There's no mystery, usually on a real suicide. Why is another story. In Jeff's case, if he killed himself, it was because he was in jail and he didn't want to be there. So there's just too much stuff that doesn't add up here. I don't know what else I could say.
And did you, Bill Barr actually gave a deposition recently.
Yes.
And it was closed door, so we don't know what he said necessarily, besides what people have leaked. Have you heard anything about what he said and the answers he gave? Do you know anything about
there was a transcript. There was a transcript of his...
Oh, there was. Okay.
Yeah.
What did he
Not
say?
an anomaly. Like I said, he said that Barr came after the fact. Barr did not come after the fact. Barr was at the autopsy. And Barbara Samson was not at the autopsy. And then she doesn't really give a reason or anything solid of why she came up with that determination. Other pathologists I've spoken to have always said that if the initial death certificate says, cause of death was pending further study, you usually don't get an answer for weeks because there's some investigation takes place to come up with an answer. There doesn't seem to be any investigation because they called it a suicide, and she just bought the party line. Maybe she heard Barr comment about, nobody would enter out, and that convinced him it was a suicide. And again, that's you can see that's based on nothing. It's based on thin air. I was also told by a kind of reliable source that cell doors were left unlocked that night. I don't know whose cell doors or how many cell doors, but, if somebody was planted in there, which is what I think took place, I don't like speculating, but if this was a suicide, not a suicide, it's likely somebody was put there as a prisoner and killed them and then transferred out. I wanted to know who the prisoners on that tier were, and there were only 12 or 14 other prisoners. It's not like we don't have to go through thousands of names. And if it was a real homicide investigation, all of them would have been questioned. They were not. So I want to find out who they were, when did they get there, and where are they today? Are they traceable? And we found one name that doesn't appear to be traceable. And he was only there for a couple of days. He arrived on the 8th, and he was gone on the 10th. And his name that was on the list doesn't show up in any court filings. So this may be someone who was planted there to do this. Because there was no reason Jeff would commit suicide. He had a hearing coming up for bail, to appeal the bail decision. Now I could see if he was going to commit suicide, wait until the hearing, because if he got bail, he'd be out. He'd be, living in his house with an ankle monitor and armed guards and cameras to make sure he didn't flee anywhere. I could see if it was denied again, then maybe he wanted to take himself out because he didn't want to wait a year in jail. I could see that, but I can't imagine he would commit suicide, days before this bail hearing. Doesn't make any sense. Everyone he spoke to prior to his death said he was very forward-looking. He was talking about defending his case. He was looking at, talking about ways to do that. It was all forward-looking. It's known that the night before he was found dead, he called his girlfriend from jail, and she was as surprised as anybody else. He sounded as fine as you could, you can under the circumstances, but he certainly was not suicidal. And then again, Bill Barr referred to the July incidents when they said Jeff tried to commit suicide before, but we know that wasn't a suicide attempt. His cellmate, that guy Taglioni, attacked him, and there's records that he told that to the guards. After the fact was over, he said he didn't remember what happened because he was afraid of retaliation. But it was not a suicide attempt, and that's why he was taken off of suicide watch so quickly. And when Bill Barr was asked why he was taken off the suicide watch so quickly, he said that like the psychologist or psychiatrist said it's better to take them off a suicide watch. That's bullshit. No qualified psychiatrist or psychologist would tell anybody to take a suicidal inmate off of suicide watch. That makes no sense at all. So Bill Barr, I believe, is very key to this cover-up. And when I started saying before, Bill Barr was the Attorney General of the United States. Kash Patel, who came up with that bullshit, suicide watch, is the head of the FBI. And if there was a real homicide investigation, the things you'd be looking at is who killed him, right? Or if it was like a mob hit, people who ordered the hit on him, and who would have something to gain by him being dead. And then he was like, well, who does Bill Barr and who does Kash Patel work for? Who are they covering up for? That becomes the question of a homicide investigation. Who would they be covering up for?
And Pam Bondi also seems to be completely complicit in this. She shut down the entire investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. Recently just said the case has been closed. There's nothing more to talk about. All these people are
the president's lackeys. They do whatever he says. I think they're protecting him. I mean, who else? If Jeffrey had dirt on Trump, he said so. Who knows? Maybe Trump had something to do with this.
Right.
Do you think we can know the name of that person that you said that it's not in the records? Maybe someone here can do like an investigation to see if maybe someone hired him, the guy that was in jail just for a couple of days.
Well, the name, I believe,
Or we can have. Oh.
the name was Hilliard, but I doubt that's whoever it was. I doubt it's his real name.
Hilliard, Hilliard. So I mean, if he's the assassin, there's no way it's his real name. I would suspect, and this is just me speculating, and tell me if you disagree with this, Mark, that it would just be somebody, maybe the CIA, right? Just taking some CIA agent, slapping on a fake name, putting him in a jumpsuit, and then someone like Barr or someone with similar authority signs off on him being transferred to the prison without any, prison or criminal history, right? So nobody can question it. It's just like, oh, this is direct from on high. This guy's coming in on the 8th. And then as soon as he's done the deed, they just ship him on out, right? And he's untraceable because it's the wrong name. I mean, the only thing that you could do to trace this guy down would be to get a video, subpoena the security camera footage, and see the guy walking into the prison, right? And get a good look at his face, and then maybe you could do some sort of facial recognition technology to see if you can tie this guy in with any sort of government agency on LinkedIn. Probably not on LinkedIn, but somewhere. I'm sure there's something where you'd have the face of this man who has some sort of connection with the government. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's good thinking. I mean, if someone was there, I was also told that after the death, a number of prisoners were transferred off of that tier. So if someone was planted there, he's one of the people that's transferred off, and he disappears into the ether because he's not a real person. To get a video. I mean, I've been trying to get video footage that not only from the tier, but what about the video footage in the infirmary or all the cameras in between the tier and the infirmary? I'd like to see what took place when they took Jeff's body from the tier to the infirmary. When the EMTs got there from the 911 call, Jeff's body was already in the infirmary. And we all know that he should not have been moved because it's a crime scene. Whether he was killed or committed suicide, it's still a crime scene. And you're not supposed to do anything until the medical examiner gets there to investigate and document it all. So by moving him and moving things around, they obliterated the crime scene, to limit it. Now, the noose that they've shown pictures of is not the noose that was around his neck. And the noose that was around his neck, we don't know where that is. We don't know if it was tested or not. So
right.
So there's a lot of unanswered questions. Again, if this was clearly a suicide, these things would not be mysteries. I'm interrupting. This is Mark. I got back on somehow, so I'm back. Yeah, but what this seems like is like the Warren Commission report with JFK's assassination. It's like no matter what they heard or what they went through, they were going to conclude that Oswald was the lone shooter. Now, we know now that that's not the case. And this seems like no matter what anyone tries to say here, they're going to come up with Jeffrey committed suicide, no matter what anything else shows. And then there's really no indication that he did, and there's no reason why he would have. But for them, it's easier to just brush him under the carpet and call it a suicide and be done with it. But there's nobody who looks at all the facts that we have thinks it's a suicide, and nobody that knew him or nobody that spoke to him. Nobody thinks that he would have committed suicide then. Basically, they heard everything. They listened. It made sense to everybody. But then, we'll get back to you, and then you don't hear. Or they say, well, we got to take another call, and they get off the phone. So, it's like you would think that he ran. Look, this team here looks at these facts, and nobody believes it's a suicide if they're hearing all this stuff and common sense. I mean, one of the things about the bail appeal, when Jeffrey was first arrested, his attorneys called me and told me he was arrested. And then a little while after, they asked me if I would participate in his bail. So I said, yeah, put up my house in Florida. He's my brother. I want him to get bail. And obviously he didn't get bail, and he's in jail sitting. And then a few weeks later, they called me, and they were going to appeal the bail decision. You heard like P. Diddy is trying to get bail a few times. So they were going to appeal the bail decision. And Jeffrey was putting up a lot of money. And this time they asked me for the appeal if I would guarantee his entire bail, in essence, doubling it. And another friend of his was also putting up some assets for bail. I don't know how much. But combined, it would have been the highest bail ever in United States history. Because I looked it up, and the highest bail in the U.S. history up to that point in time was $100 million. Now, that might still be the record. I don't know. I haven't Googled it recently. But Jeffrey's bail would have been substantially higher than that with his assets and my assets and his friend's assets. So, so maybe there's a chance he would have gotten bail. So why the hell would he kill himself, like a week or so before he'd have that hearing? I don't think they had a date set for the hearing, but usually it's in a matter of days once you make the motion for the bail appeal. So why would he kill himself? That makes no sense. And if he got bail, he'd be living in his house, with an ankle monitor and armed guards and cameras to make sure he didn't flee anywhere. And, so it doesn't make any sense that he would kill himself then. Let me be really clear about something. I am Jeffrey's sole heir, but I am not a beneficiary. Most people read that because his will was public, it said that I'm his sole heir, and that if there was no will, I would inherit his entire estate. Okay, it says that in the will, which means there is a will, which means I don't inherit his entire estate. The reason that wording is in the will is to prevent anybody else from coming up claiming to be an heir and trying to get his money. I don't know how old or young anybody is here, but Howard Hughes was a very wealthy man years ago. And, he owned TWA Airlines. He owned casinos in Vegas. He was one of the wealthiest guys around. And when he died, he had a bad will. And it took like 30 years or something to settle his estate because people came out of the woodwork claiming to be his heirs, claiming that he promised them money. There was all kinds of stories coming out. So today, when you put a will together, you add language in to prevent people from trying to attack your will. Also, in Jeffrey's will, it said if anybody questions the will, they're entitled to $1. So that prevents people from wasting time trying to fight your will because all they're going to get is $1. So Jeffrey's estate, first of all, I'm not an executor of his estate. I have nothing to do with his assets. Jeffrey and I traditionally were not in each other's wills because he didn't need my money and I didn't need his. And all of his assets went into a trust. This is all public information. And I am not a trustee of the trust. I have no idea what the trust says. I'm not privy to it. I don't really communicate with the executors. They have nothing to talk to me about. I have nothing to do with Jeffrey's assets. But most people read that I was his sole heir, and everybody assumed that I was getting his money. So after he died, I got calls literally from all around the planet from people wanting to help me manage the money, from people wanting to help me sell the houses and the planes, people wanting me to invest in things, people wanting me to donate money to things. But I have nothing to do with Jeffrey's money. So that's all fictitious. I don't get any of Jeffrey's money. And I have nothing to do with it. So what happened and where monies might have been gone, I have nothing to do with that. So I really have no answer for you. I'm not expecting to get any money, so I really don't care what was going on. Now, I do know that the estate is monitored. They have to, since his death, they have to file quarterly reports to the courts in the Virgin Islands and wherever, reporting the money. I know that I don't think they have that obligation. I'm pretty sure they would do that because they're staying on top of everything. But, what exactly is happening and where it's going. I know there was big taxes and some other charges, but again, I don't keep track of the day-to-day of that because it's not my money and I really don't care.
Fair enough. And I guess you were a member of the Humpty Dumpty Institute for a few years. I think you chaired it as well. You did some work alongside Adam Schiff, Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Absolutely. I was very active with Humpty Dumpty. I'm aware of the phone call that Donald called him. I said, what Jeffrey told me is that Donald called him as one of these, could you believe it? kind of that he won. You know, he was as surprised as anybody else. But that's the limit of that conversation I had with Jeffrey about it. He told me Donald called him to say that, but there was no talk about Jeffrey being part of the government or anything other than that Donald called him, you know, like I said, to say, could you believe this? I know in the 90s they were very, very close. I'm not sure exactly when their friendship parted ways. You know, like I said, Jeffrey and I had different lives, different groups of friends. After 2004, Jeff and I didn't get together very much. Maybe between 2004 and 2012, maybe we saw each other a half a dozen times. And between 2012 and 2019, when he died, I didn't see him at all for those 7 years. 2004 was when my mother passed away. So I used to see Jeff a lot more frequently while my mother was alive because we'd see her together quite often. But after she passed away, you know, like I said, Jeffrey, we had our own groups of friends, own life, but we were always in communication. You know, so exactly what he did with Donald and when. But I know back in the 90s, they were really good friends. They used to hang out together and fly in each other's plane. I was once on Jeff's plane flying up from Florida, and Donald was with us. So that was in 1999. I remember that flight. But Jeff was on Donald's plane a number of times. Look, Donald used to put my mother, a couple of times, they put my mother and my aunts up at the hotels in Atlantic City. Just as a comp them because, you know, his friendship with Jeffrey. And he didn't comp them because they were gambling whales. They were not gambling whales. You know, they weren't big gamblers. That's not why he comped them. He comped them as a favor to Jeff. They were really good friends. You know, he had a place in Paris. He had a place in New Mexico, the ranch in New Mexico. We had the island, in the Virgin Islands. He had a place in New York. He had a place in Palm Beach. Years ago, in the 80s, he lived in London for a while, but he rented there. I don't believe he owned that place. I actually visited him there. It was in 85.
Do we really believe that he's actually dead? Is there actually any 100% proof that he's dead?
Yeah, I was the one who identified his body the day after he died.
Before I ask my question, I'm really glad that people are focused in on Bill Barr.
Yeah, I first, you're welcome, and it's my pleasure. I believe when you say that the current administration is not going to try to help because I think they might be culpable in this. I mean, like I said, Bill Barr's obviously full of shit with a lot of things he says, and you know, Kash Patel and Pam Bondi, they're all saying things that I'm from New York, so I may be a little bit crude, but they're like talking out of their ass, you know, with the stuff they're saying. As far as the governor and the state, the issue is that it took place in a federal prison. So I'm not sure if they could fall under their jurisdiction to investigate this. Maybe they can. Maybe they can, usurp that authority or something. But it's worth looking into. Yes, thank you.
Live one. Go ahead, sir. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you. Hello, Mark. I'm Ian Carpenter here from New York also. It's great to be able to get some answers from you. Thank you. I understand Jeff Staley, who was working as your brother's banker for many years, he testified this year in the UK in a banking tribunal and gave sworn testimony that he had, as he said, consensual sex with a woman introduced to him by your brother in your apartment in Manhattan on 66th Street. Now, my question is, do you know who might have helped Jeff Staley, know where to go, or who made those kind of arrangements? Again, Jeff Staley, former CEO of Barclays and also worked at JP Morgan, testified in March of this year that he had consensual sex with a woman who was part of Epstein's staff. My question is, who might have handled those kind of arrangements to get the keys and those types of things? Thank you.
Okay, I know the name Staley. I remember hearing about him in the news. First of all, let me make it really clear. You referenced that it took place in my apartment. I don't live in that building. Okay, I own a lot of apartments in that building, and Jeff used a bunch of those. I have a business partner who manages that building, and after Jeffrey died, I had to find out which apartments he was actually using, because like I said, I don't keep track of that building. My business partner does. So I don't know what kind of arrangements or help somebody would need if somebody was living if Jeff had some girls living in the building, he would have to tell Staley or anybody else would go to the building, go to whatever apartment was there. And I guess whoever was in the apartment would let them in. I don't think anybody had to arrange anything, you know.
Well, I mean, who might have given him the keys or told him what apartment it was?
But I don't know. Like I said, Jeff and I didn't do business together. I don't know what he was involved with or who he was involved with, you know, at the time. So I have no idea about that.
But sometimes he used some of those apartments that you owned?
Yeah, he used a bunch of apartments. He rented the apartments from us. He paid rent. He paid their condominium apartments, so he paid the maintenance on the apartment. I wasn't looking to make money on my brother. Normally, if I rented them to other people, I would, you know, make a profit. But Jeffrey,
do you know what he was using them for? Because it doesn't seem like he really needed to get into the landlord-tenant type of income arrangements. Do you know what they were used for?
Well, like I mentioned before, I do know that his pilots stayed there if they were in New York and they needed to stay in New York. But whenever Jeff flew, he had a co-pilot, a pilot, and a big plane. He had a flight engineer. So he'd always have to put them up at hotels. But in New York City, they could stay in one of the apartments there. I know his attorney used one of the apartments for an office or something. And he had some other friends staying in the building at certain times. But
I think Ehud Barak stayed there, and so did Jean-Luc Brunel, right?
Well, I don't know about Brunel. He might have. I don't know. But Barak, yes, I saw him there. I know he stayed.
Has the Department of Justice reached out to you more than just with letters? I mean, have you sat down with any investigators at any time, and have they asked you any questions? Because I would think a good FBI or a good DOJ would have sat down with you and had a lot of questions.
Yes, they did. Yeah, shortly after Jeff's death, I met with the DOJ people, the Attorney General's office, and they asked me questions about the building, the same kind of questions you're asking me, and I gave them the answers. First of all, Jeffrey and I did no business together other than this landlord-tenant relationship that we had because he rented apartments that I owned. But we did no other business together. They were questioning me about how I ended up owning the building. And I told them what was going on, and they were satisfied. And they were, what happened after Jeffrey died. I mentioned, his attorneys asked me if I would put up, participate in his bail. So I said yes, as I put up my house in Florida for his bail, because I'd like to see him get bail. And obviously he didn't get bail. But what happened is most people didn't know Jeffrey had a brother. And now all of a sudden it's like, who's this brother guy, that's putting up his house? And I started getting calls and people trying to look at me, trying to tie me into his activities. And this went on for quite a while. And then once everybody realized that, no, there's no dirt here, I had nothing to do with any of his activities, then they all started calling me to help them with their stories. They wanted back information on Jeffrey. I told them to go take a hike. But I did meet with the Justice Department and answered all their questions, and they left me alone because they know I wasn't culpable. You never see me mention it anything. That his victims had no idea. I mean, even I met Bill Clinton, completely separate from Jeffrey. And when I met him, I just said to him casually, I said, "All right, I hear you're palling around with my brother." And he looked at me like I'm sort of taken aback because. I was so casual with him, And then he looked at me and I said, "Jeffrey Epstein's my brother." And he looked like shocked. And then he just said, he goes, "Your brother's quite a guy." And that was his comment. But so most people didn't know Jeffrey had a brother unless you knew us from way back when.
Do you think an intelligence agency was involved, given the nearly 30 visits that are on record of the former prime minister of Israel? And do you think that there is an intelligence agency that's involved? And do you think it was a blackmail operation? Or let me just keep it to one question and not complicate it. Do you think an intelligence agency was involved in this?
I think if any intelligence agency was involved, it was the U.S. intelligence agency. Because I don't know what other intelligence agency could orchestrate something like this in a federal prison. It's the DOJ that tells the Bureau of Prisons, put this guy somewhere. It's not the Bureau of Prisons. They don't decide who goes where, who goes to prison or not. That's the DOJ. So if somebody was planted in there to kill Jeffrey, it had to come from the DOJ or someone from our intelligence sources. the CIA, some covert operatives, whatever it took. I don't see how a foreign government could orchestrate this through the DOJ and the Bureau of Prisons.
Well, I don't mean that an intelligence agency would be involved in the orchestration of selecting a prison. What I meant was, it appears that Jeffrey's real estate holdings and his ability to travel around the world and meet with the Pope and to be able to go to Queen Elizabeth's cottage at Windsor Castle and his extensive property holdings do not seem to correlate with income that he was able to make, even if it was in the millions and millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. It seems that there was far more money involved than he would be able to generate.
Well, Jeffrey was a shrewd investor. He started as a young man on Wall Street, and he learned how to make money on Wall Street. And when he learned in the old days, Wall Street was kind of corrupt. He used to come home and tell a story. Jeffrey told me back in the late 70s when he started on Wall Street, we were still living in Brooklyn. He said, I'll never forget, he said, if the general population knew what was taking place on Wall Street, there'd be a revolution in this country. That's exactly what he said.
You don't think an intelligence agency would be involved, given that the former prime minister stayed with him more than 30 times?
Barack and me, they were friends. And he lived in the 66th Street building. He lived in one of those apartments for a while. Yeah, I was also told he was a good currency trader. So, Jeffrey knew how to make money all sorts of ways. That's why when I hear things about blackmail, I don't think he blackmailed anyone for money. Jeffrey made money years ago. Look, in 1991, Jeffrey had a private jet back then. And and private jets were not as popular or as common as they are today. So this was back in 91. Before any of this nonsense, Jeffrey was making big money. Because, like I said, Jeff and I did no business together. I am not in the financial community. That's not where I spend my time. So I own real estate. That's my field. That's what I'm good at. So I don't really play much with the markets.
And so have you reviewed those 302 documents where the victims name the people who victimized them?
If I personally know.
And let's bring them up here into the room. These are women who came to the Hill and testified that they were groomed and raped at the age of 14 and 16 years old, and they called to meet with the president and to meet with the FBI and to have people investigate their claims. Some of them have never testified before. If you are so interested in getting the public to submit any information, why have you not met with them? You said you haven't met with them. Have you met with them? I'll give you one more chance.
My job as the FBI director is to invite
Is the
all
answer yes or no
leads
to whether or not you met with these women who were sexually abused and raped?
Any insinuation by you or any people on your side that I am not manhunting child predators and sex traffickers.
Do any of you feel that the DOJ has communicated with you enough this year? No. Have any of you had any communication with the DOJ?
No.
Nobody in this room has heard at all from the Department of Justice?
No.
Let me ask you one last question. And that is, right after she gives this testimony in front of an FBI agent, among others, she's transferred to a minimum security prison not suitable for a sex offender like herself. Who made that decision and why?
The Bureau of
one-year penalty for inciting riots. We took the freedom of speech away because that's been through the courts, and the court said you have freedom of speech. But what has happened is when they burn a flag, it agitates and irritates crowds. We took the freedom of speech away.